let me get back to my screen here. Okay. So again, every year we review world press trends. We think about how we can develop it, evolve it, and but most importantly, when we look at it, we look at how we can improve it with an eye toward our members. And this edition, sorry, one second. My whole computer is frozen up here, so I will. It looks like I'm going to have to go to some notes, which is unprepared. So in this edition, we took a slightly different approach, obviously considering the unique circumstances of the last year and a half, particularly with the pandemic. And so we focused the report primarily on a rather large publisher survey that went out to about we had about almost 100 responses from publishers all over the world. And so I hope you have the report. If not, at the end of this presentation, you'll have a chance to see the details, and we can get you the report. So for the presentation, I've pulled out some of the bigger highlights that we think. It's a massive, the report is a huge slide deck, and I will try to get through as many of these slides with time willing. So can you go to the next slide, Suresh, please? Okay. As we already heard, I mean, to say the least, 2020 was an incredibly challenging year. Also for analysis like myself, but others in other industries that try to make forecasts. Our findings, particularly on the next slide that you'll see in a minute, around some of the performance indicators, are basically our best estimates considering the rather unpredictable situation. There's one thing that I've learned about this project, and it's definitely the case also here in India, I'm sure, is that global figures, global trends tell one story, but they don't always describe the experiences of individual publishers or individual regions or individual markets. And in 2020, and I would say in the last months, that's never been more true. Next slide, please. So the development of the business and bottom line figures is always telling. So we'll start there. Next slide. So here's a sort of a snapshot of how the industry looks across the 4 core revenue streams. That is print and digital advertising and print and digital circulation. So this does not include more non-traditional revenue, some of the other revenue streams that are becoming more and more important as we go forward, things like events, e-commerce, marketing services, data services, and much more. But regardless of year-on-year declines in print advertising and print circulation, as we've already heard, which has happened for years now, publishers still rely heavily on that income versus digital in terms of their core revenue streams. So according to our estimates, publishers are earning globally about 82% of their total revenue from print still, and that revenue is going to prove vital for publishers that are pivoting or continuing to transition to a more digitally focused business. Overall revenue, as you can see, contracted by 11%. And this is based on a number of figures that we have some historical data, but also through other associations and different data partners where we collect data. The big losses in ad revenue and circulation as well, we have to remember this is one bad part, but it already came on the heels of a market that was actually, to say, challenging at the least in terms of the declines we've been seeing in the last few years. So in short, print ad revenue was down 19.5% in 2020. Print circulation revenue down 13%. So just to put that into perspective, the New York Times had, as you may have heard, an incredible year in 2020 in terms of digital subscription growth and revenue. But even the Times took a major hit on the ad side. Total ad revenue at the New York Times fell 26% in 2020, with print ad revenue bearing the brunt of that decline at 39%. So it just goes to show you that everybody was affected by the pandemic, has been and still will be. A lot of the questions remain, of course, around where some of the ad revenue, some of the different sectors, will they come back to pre-pandemic levels or not? We've heard some forecasts that actually in the next year, it might not be as bad as we thought it was going to be. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the forecasts in some of the later slides. But back to this slide, just quickly. We estimate that publishers actually increased their digital ad revenue globally 8.8%. This was a big surprise for me, according to the publishers that we surveyed. And of course, with the cookieless world coming on, publishers' strategy there and the actual results will be interesting to see. I guess everybody heard Google announced that they're going to delay stopping cookies in at least for a year, but maybe 2 years. Digital subscriptions, albeit a very small part of overall revenue, still remain a bright spot for publishers in many regions of the world, and that was definitely the case in 2020. And as we have heard across other content and entertainment industries, subscriptions, e-commerce, it really took off during the pandemic. So this resulted in digital subscriptions increasing by 23%. And then naturally, as a result of that, or the other way around, perhaps, newspapers' website traffic was reached almost historic levels during at least at the first part of the pandemic. Next slide, please. And this is just sort of a more granular look at the revenue breakdown or the revenue development over the past 6 years. Blue is digital advertising, red is print advertising, orange is digital circulation, and green is print circulation. So you get a good idea about what is really still driving the business, and globally, especially in terms of the bottom line. But at the same time, you clearly see the historical decline there and the upward trend of digital. Next slide. So let's turn to our publisher survey, which gauges 2020 results in 2021 and beyond priorities. But let's first start with how the pandemic impacted the bottom line according to publishers. Next slide. So as you can see, 43% of respondents, that's publishers, reported that their revenues declined by more than 20% last year. About 27% stayed the same, and impressively, 11% said they even increased revenue by more than 20%. Next slide. So with all that said, it helps perhaps to, we wanted to provide a little context of how that matched up to the Great Recession back in 2008 or up to around 2010. So more than twice as many publishers in this year's study have reported overall revenue declines, as I mentioned, of more than 20% over the past year compared to the economic crisis a decade ago. However, more than 4 times as many publishers, 27% in 2020 compared to 7% in 2011, reported no change in their revenues over the past year. And the 11% of publishers who reported more than 20%, that is 5.5 times the number who said that was actually the case after the previous global economic shock. We look for silver linings in this report sometimes. So next slide, please. So this looks at how publishers said their revenue streams developed over 2020, and is quite similar to what some of the first slide I showed about some of the more historical data. Publishers, however, actually reported that digital subscription revenue, which we've heard already was a bright spot, it increased by 26.9%, and that was about 3% higher than the historical figures we had. But it's worth mentioning that while that figure is impressive, globally, again, the industry is still predominantly dependent on advertising and print revenue. Digital circulation, from our estimates, makes up about 6% of publishers' overall revenue globally. That's talking about core revenue streams. This just shows sort of the vast difference in levels of priorities for publishers regarding digital subscription strategies, as we've heard so much about reader revenue over the last few years. So there are publishers, though, like Mediapart in France, which is a pure player, but actually has a background in newspapers. Mediapart is 100% funded by digital subscriptions, and they're doing quite well. And then, of course, we have in the middle there, which is also sort of a beacon of inspiration for everybody, the New York Times, which has nearly 40% of its overall revenue coming from digital subscriptions. On the other end, we know that we have publishers that aren't even charging for content or about to charge for content. I know in India, there are a number of publishers that are charging for content now, and some that are looking into it. And I'm curious to hear about that over the next few days as well. So going back to the slide, digital advertising from the publisher side increased 8.8% year on year. And other revenue, as you see there, includes, as I mentioned before, e-commerce, events, syndication, selling data. And that's a decent figure, but that will become increasingly important for publishers' strategy over the next years. And as we said earlier, overall revenue was down 11%. And again, print advertising took the biggest hit, down 19.4%, and circulation down 12.8%. Next slide, please. So I thought I would, yeah, there we go. I thought I would just sneak this slide in. This is from a poll that we conducted in November at our Digital Media Europe event. I think there was about 110 attendees during that actual session, and we asked them how they thought their digital subscription growth might develop this year. And as you can see, it's quite there's a big expectation for digital subscriptions to grow, at least if that audience was here in Europe. Okay, let's go to slide 11, please. Next slide. There we go. And as we've heard, many publishers, achieve record traffic numbers to their sites during the pandemic, but that created many opportunities to not only attract new users into their brands to get data, but also convert them to paying customers. But on the downside of that slide there, of course, with the lockdowns firmly in effect, it was clear that print readership would be impacted. One note that, and I would be curious to hear India's also figures, when we sent the survey to our national associations in Germany, the national association there actually reported that print readership, not circulation, but readership actually increased by 5%. Next slide, please. So this was actually a bit of a surprise for us, that considering all the uncertainty and some of the damage that was done during the pandemic, that from the survey, only 4.4% cost reduction we found. Now, that is true that the vast majority of those publishers that did report such cost cuts also experienced double-digit revenue declines. Next slide. Okay, so let's turn more to the outlook, looking a little more forward. Okay, next slide, please. So we heard about this earlier, and you can make the argument that perhaps this could or should be the first slide that I started with. When we ask publishers, what is the single most important change that has to be implemented in their organizations in the coming year, that was looking forward to 2021 and a little beyond, accelerating digital transformation strategy was absolutely the overwhelming priority. Indeed, the pandemic has laid bare those publishers that can excel and that can adapt, and it's also exposed those that perhaps are lagging in the necessity to develop products quickly, and quite simply to truly focus on an audience-first strategy. Next slide. Sorry, keep that up, Suresh. But I mean, what is digital transformation? I mean, it's such an overarching phrase, but it's also an overarching strategy. And for most companies, the specifics of that are starting to look increasingly like, as I mentioned before, an audiences first strategy, reader revenue, digital subscriptions, steep in data and product development. So it's no coincidence that the three next most important changes on that slide are the same as those as the top investment plans which publishers have, which we'll show on the next slide. So after digital transformation on the priorities here, it's the next priorities are accelerating reader revenue plans, data analytics, and more tech investment. Next slide. So turning to investments, it's again, it's not surprising that the top investment priorities publishers told us are all closely linked to reader revenue strategies. Number one being paid for digital content, followed by technologies and data needed to support reader revenue strategies. Then the skill sets in the newsroom, product dev, and new forms of journalism. On the divestment side, as I mentioned earlier in our World Printers Forum Outlook survey, 70.5% of production executives told us that they have reduced their workforce since the pandemic began, and that they expect more cuts in 2021. But in that same survey, that 70% also told us that they plan to invest in 2021, mostly in pre-press equipment, software, but especially retrofitting press equipment. Next slide, please. So we asked publishers what are their main sources of income. So yes, ad revenue is incredibly under pressure and now accounts for about 46% of traditional income globally. But for many in our industry, it is still the most important source of income, they told us. And that's followed by subscriptions, single copy sales. In some markets or regions, depending on the business model of a publisher, of course, ad revenue still contributes as much as 70 to 80% of revenue. And much of that is still coming from print. It is encouraging here, though, looking at this slide, to see significant development in revenue, such as events, as we mentioned before, as well as a decent presence of other revenue streams. I just want to mention that that's one thing in our upcoming survey and our upcoming report on World Press Trends, which will come out earlier than the one did this year. We're actually going to try to delve a little deeper into other revenue streams for World Press Trends. And then separately, we hope to have a report a separate report about other revenue streams. Next slide. So when we asked publishers in our 2017 outlook what was the greatest risk to their business, a lack of innovation was the #1 choice. Here it is a distant fourth to declining ad revenue. Hope I have the right slide there, not sure. But while there's an obvious need and push for publishers to try to create new revenue streams, when we asked publishers how much of their revenues needed to come from new and more diverse revenue streams outside of circulation and advertising in order to reach their objectives in 2021, that number actually shrunk considerably in this year's survey compared to 4 years ago. It just shows the diversifying that, to diversify your business is an easy thing to say, but it is indeed more of a long-term strategy to get there. Next slide, please. how am I doing on the time here? Okay, 12 minutes. Okay, so now we're just going to look a little bit some of these things you may have heard about, how outside of the revenue side, you know, how the pandemic has impacted our business, our workflows. Next slide. So as over 60% of the respondents to our survey were top managers, it's not incredibly surprising that more than 9 out of 10 said their organization's top management responded appropriately to the pandemic. In the middle there, only a small group, 13%, or about 1 in 8, do not think that the health crisis will change the way their company's workflow and processes will work going forward. And the majority of the respondents, that's the one on the far right, are optimistic about the long-term impact of the pandemic on their companies. So 65% think that they will fully recover from the pandemic, while 35% do not think so. Next slide. Yeah, so there's a little doubt that the physical workplace in many places may never be the same, and also that it will be definitely under the microscope. Publishers, particularly larger publishers, are looking at, you know, their big buildings, their big newsrooms, and as this shows, they'll be looking to reduce some of their investment. It's clear that, of course, a lot of people will be working from home office, and how this will impact workflows, I think, is still an ongoing process. Next slide. So gauging media's companies' sort of cost allocation across their operations is not easy, but it's something that we felt like that we wanted to take a sort of a stab at to get a general idea. Next slide, please. So if you go back, I don't know, 10 years ago, it's pretty clear that nearly 50% of a publisher's costs came from print production, particularly with newsprint and distribution. Of course, that varies from company to company and region to region. But with digital transformation as a sort of a core strategy for most newspapers in recent years, it's not surprising that print costs have shifted quite significantly. According to our survey, 21.4% make up total costs for print production. But what is encouraging here, I think, is that the editorial costs make up the 33.5% of the business. And that, while that's impressive, if you go back even 10 or 20 years ago, there were a lot of times when it was actually 35%. As we know, there have been a lot of cuts in the newsroom, particularly in regions like the North America and the UK. So to see this, you know, the increased cost investment in newsroom is encouraging. Next slide, please. So just a couple of quick slides on looking at some of the audience traffic. Okay, next slide, please. One slide here. So, you know, while I think it's increasingly obvious that it's worth everything is going to, our audiences are becoming more and more focused on digital content, consuming that. What does that mean today? That means they're consuming their content more often on their mobile phones. That's not a big surprise, but I think we as publishers, it's good to be maybe shaken up a little bit and reminded that, because that is becoming the platform which has a number of consequences of how to present content. And as 5G devices and networks hopefully start to spread even more around the world, that mobile strategy will take on an even greater importance. So next slide, please. So back to advertising. Just a couple of slides coming up here that are sort of contradictory for news publishers. Next slide. So this is a look at digital ad spend. And speaking of mobile, as the overwhelming platform for digital news consumption continues, and with, again, the rollout of more 5G networks that gives greater speed, the ease of consuming, for example, video content, the ad spend will continue to follow there. So it's not surprising that the mobile internet makes up 36.3% of global ad spend. So unfortunately, on the other end, newspapers account for only about 5.7% of ad spend. That's print and digital. And these figures come from Zenith Optimedia. And Zenith is projecting global ad spend to rise 5.6% this year, but that'll still be below the level it was in 2019. Next slide. Okay, maybe I hope you've seen this report. We work with CNO International to conduct an annual survey about consumer ad trust. And we asked about 40,000 consumers around 40 countries simply how they agree or disagree that information that that's conveyed in advertising, is it trustworthy? And it's kind of based on a scoring system. And the results of this year's study back up those of last year, that consumers consider traditional news media, that's printed newspapers, local newspapers, and their websites, as the most trusted media to consume advertising. So perhaps you can actually use some of this information to help you sell some advertising, perhaps. Next slide, please. So I just want to get this in because, as we know, diversity is becoming incredibly more important across society, but also particularly in the media industry, and it's especially important for WAN-IFRA. Next slide, please. But despite numerous declarations about just that, and the best intentions, perhaps, of many business, the numbers just don't add up. A case in point, in our publisher survey, 34% of news executives disagreed that women and/or members of minority groups face barriers to career progression in the news media industry. 47.5% agreed that my organization is committed to diversity and inclusion as a value. Yet this study on this slide by Reuters Institute serves as a reminder of the real gap that still exists. In this case, this is about gender diversity, and the study analyzed the gender breakdown of top editors in 12 markets. Only 22% of 180 top editors across the 240 brands are women, despite the fact that on average, 40% of journalists in the 12 markets are women. So obviously there's quite a bit of work to do there. Next slide. So thanks so much. Sorry for the tech glitch there, but this is where you can find the report. But more importantly, if you just send me an email, I will gladly try to get you the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. There are a few questions that have come up in the Q&A. Do you have a chance to look at your screen, or do you want me to ask you a question?
Yeah, unfortunately, my screen's it's frozen somehow. I can't. I cannot even click on anything. So I'm not sure what happened.
Okay, there's one question. It's asked: is the decline in ad revenue in print, is it uniform across the region, or there's a difference in how it's in different countries?
Oh, it's definitely. Well, I think globally it's down. That's for sure. But from region to region, no doubt, it was great. Say for example, in the U.S. and North America, it was down much more. I would say definitely greater. I can't say a certain percentage, but I think advertising was down 19.5% globally. So as you heard in the New York Times, I think their print ad revenue was down almost 40%, and I think that's a pretty good indicator of perhaps across like North America, for example, in circulation also. But for example, in some regions it wasn't so dramatic. In parts of Asia, for example, but it's difficult to say from region to region.
Okay. And did our report cover scenario in the broadcasting industry? In fact, I think a couple of them are asking about whether the costs, we have any study for the broadcasting industry?
No, ours did not. We focused purely on newspapers, and of course, a number of newspaper groups own broadcasts. What we might get into, as I mentioned earlier, in the other revenue streams, it would be interesting to see some breakdowns of that of a larger group, but not any specific plans about broadcast just yet.
Okay. There's one question, interesting actually, asking about, okay, when you said that the cost of operations, I mean, it is more on the editorial, productions become, which traditionally used to be the largest share of expenses. Now it is the editorial. So with a lot of newsrooms working from home, and their cost of coverage has come down. So how does it reflect in the report?
Well, we don't. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, it's a great point. I think we wouldn't have those figures until the survey we do now. Sorry, I'm hearing some back noise.
Suresh, you got to put your mic in mute, please. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, I got off track. What was the question again?
Yeah, talking about the cost of operations and working from home, is it really bringing down the cost of operation?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's one of the questions that in our survey that we will ask coming up. So we'll see how that comes out, but that's difficult to say. I'm sure there are some cost savings, but as I mentioned, in a number of places, I mean, we know that people will start either renting or maybe selling off some of their properties. So there could potentially be some savings or revenue, even depending on how you look at it.
Yeah. Thank you, Dune. I think that's all. That's the time we have for today, and there are a lot of questions on the Q&A. Maybe I can post some of them to you, and then you can answer them later.
I'd be happy to. So you can send them to me, and I'd be happy to respond.
Sure. Fine. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for the session. So with this, we come to the end of the opening session and the first presentation. I request all the participants to go back to the timeline and join the next session. We have a very interesting panel by the CEOs of 3 leading Indian newspapers joining us there. See you all there in the next session. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Prashant.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.